We're in that stage of parenting in our family where if it's a school morning and I were to say, all right, kids, it's 8 o'clock, let's go. It's not unlikely that I might hear the reply, no, it's 7:57, Dad. That's not the point. Get in the car, let's go. That's the point. Let's go. Now think if the Apostle Paul, if he were ministering today in the U.S., among us, here even at Westview, I think he might have a similar sentiment at times. We have focused on and fixated on things, and he's just, that's not the point. You're focusing on the things that you're not supposed to be focusing on. We're stepping into chapter 13 here this morning, 1 Corinthians, famous passage. One of the most well-known, most often quoted passages in the Bible, probably. We've all been to a wedding at some point, certainly with an excerpt from this chapter that had been recited. Maybe you're thinking, Pastor, that's pretty clever of you. Here we go. Just a couple less than 2 weeks out from Valentine's Day, and you're starting in on the love chapter. How appropriate. That's not the point. That's what Paul, I think, would be most eager to convey to us. That's not the point. Now, God willing, next week we'll continue on in chapter 13 and get to the heart of the passage here where Paul is describing the nature of love. But the point of the chapter is not to convey a warm sentimentality. I think that becomes clear to us as we see the context of this whole unit, that this chapter is tucked in between a chapter on either side addressing spiritual gifts and a corrective to the church in how it is that they are conducting themselves as it relates to spiritual things, as it relates to these gifts. So we've got chapter 12 where he's introducing these gifts, these spiritual things, and he comes back to it in chapter 14. And that structure, just like what we saw earlier in the chapter, in the book, when Paul did a similar thing in chapter 8, where he started to talk about things pertaining to idolatry, and then paused and talked about how he has forgone his own apostolic rights, and then he returned to food that had been offered up to idols. He's following a similar pattern here. And so that chapter there in the middle is serving as a framework, as an interpretive key for us to understand the main point of what Paul is trying to communicate in this broader section. And so it is not how lovey-dovey and romantic we ought to feel about love, these warm affections that will well up in our hearts when we look in the eyes of our beloved. It's not what he's after. No, this chapter, it's an admonition. It's a rebuke. The church is not loving. They are not conducting themselves in the way that they ought. They're not considering others more significant than themselves. They're using these gifts wrongly. The fundamental problem in Corinth is that they have not love. And that's what Paul aims to address. They're not displaying those outworkings of love that flow from the gospel. Now, these 3 introductory verses that Pastor Zach read for us, it's here that Paul is making the point that doing great and phenomenal things without love, it's worthless. It means nothing. No matter how great and phenomenal the gifts of the Spirit might be in you, the manifestation of the Spirit present in your life that He has equipped you and empowered you to do, if they're done without love, it means nothing. It's pointless. It's worthless. You see, our impulse and proclivity, each and every one of us, as it relates to our gifts, as it relates to the resources, whatever has been given to us, our proclivity is to incline towards self-glory, not others' glory. Every good and perfect thing that our Father above has given to us, the flesh seeks to take and twist and malign to exalt ourselves, not to exalt others, chiefly Christ. And that's what Paul is after here. So, put positively, I think what Paul is conveying to us is that we ought to pursue the purpose, significance, and gain of a selfless concern for others. That's what love looks like. Pursue the purpose, significance, and gain of selfless concern for others. Now, maybe as you've read this passage or just hearing pastors read that, you maybe picked up on a key feature of these three verses, that each verse is essentially saying the exact same thing. Paul's not really communicating something different between verse 1 and verse 2 and 2 and 3. He's communicating the same thing. And so there is this formulaic structure here to each of the verses that Paul, he starts by mentioning some gift or action. That's step 1. Step 2 is he writes the words, but have not love. And then step 3, he concludes each verse with the negative result of this whole situation. So we're going to trace that structure to see that Paul is calling us to three things. He's calling us to forgo the phenomenal, to find the way, and to discover purpose, significance, and gain. So that structure that's repeated 3 times here will form our structure as we look at these passages. In each of these verses, Paul, he begins by highlighting some phenomenal expression of the Spirit's gifts or Christian devotion, like what we see in verse 3. It's not just the tongues of men that Paul references, that gift that was most evidently displayed there in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, where the apostles were given that very thing. They were given the supernatural ability to speak in such a way that men and women from all across the Mediterranean world heard them declaring the praise of God in their own language. They were given the tongues of men. But Paul goes beyond that here to something even more remarkable that he references, even to speak in the tongues of angels. I think he heightens the hyperbole, especially in verse 2, where he speaks of, if I were to understand all mysteries and all knowledge, having all faith, so as to remove mountains. If I could even do that, he's speaking of these great expressions of gifts that God's Spirit would be pleased to make. I think that kind of overstatement is in what's characterizing Paul's description of these gifts as the first element of each verse. I think that's what leads the translators here for the ESV that we're reading from to translate that first gift as prophetic powers. You see, Paul, he didn't actually make reference to powers. Paul, he just simply said, if I have prophecy. I think the translators are adding the word powers in there to help convey that sense that Paul is speaking of the most phenomenal expressions of these kinds of gifts. And likewise, when we get down there to not gifts per se, but these acts of devotion in verse 3 that Paul envisions giving away all that I have and delivering up his even own body. I think what's going on in Corinth and how they were operating and thinking about such things, and what we're even inclined to as well, is that if the Spirit is going to give gifts, certainly it's going to be like this, right? If we're talking about spiritual gifts, it has to be phenomenal expressions, right? And people who are given such gifts, if there's going to be a demonstration of the Spirit and power, well, it's going to look like these kinds of things. And so, well, we ought to esteem such people who have been given such gifts, such powerful displays, such miraculous expressions of the Spirit's presence in their life, Certainly, those are the kinds of people that we ought to aspire to be like. Those are the kinds of people we should put forward and put up front. That's what we should strive to be like. Those are the parts of the body even that are really something, aren't they? Wow. And we get so impressed with such people. And they get so impressed with themselves. Good indicator of the problem that Paul's addressing in Corinth is that final description, the final act of Christian devotion that he mentions, that he would give up his own body to be burned. It's perhaps more likely that Paul actually wrote that he would give himself over in order that he may boast. That it's boasting that he's referencing, not martyrdom by conflagration. So it seems to indicate, I think, that it's that kind of boastful spirit that is at play in Corinth as it relates to these gifts, that they draw attention to the phenomenal expression of them, that those are the greatest and highest and most important, most valuable. But as you remember back to what we looked at last week in the body illustration in chapter 12, that flow of thought that Paul was expressing to us, and the corrective that he was providing there in the body imagery, is that no body part is indispensable. And no body part is uniquely exalted. Okay? The different parts of the body and the different gifts are meant to serve one another. It's not intended by God and his sovereign, wise, and good design for any single part of the body to be exalted and lifted up in and of itself. No, these gifts, these parts are distributed and appointed as he wills for the good of the body. That the whole body would grow up together. That the whole body would rejoice with its varied parts. So we pick up that these phenomenal expressions here in these 3 verses, they're not actually being commended. That would run contrary to Paul's whole argument of chapter 12. Well, Paul's point is that these gifts and acts of devotion, they very well could be splendid gifts, wonderful manifestations of the Spirit that we ought to give thanks for. If God were to give such gifts, we ought to receive them gladly, absolutely, and to return to him with thanks and praise. But these gifts, they're not necessarily the greatest and best expressions of the Spirit's manifestation among us. And so we ought to forgo the phenomenal and not fixate on the flashy, the attention-grabbing gifts. They are not inherently better. Let's try to think of a similar dynamic. I think it's helpful to think of gifts of the Spirit, however he so is pleased to give them, to think of them in the similar context as financial wealth. Financial wealth is a gift, resources that we have been entrusted with. You don't have you don't receive what you ask for because you want to spend it on your passions. James 4:3. That's why you perhaps are hindered from having more. It's because you're asking wrongly. Or Paul's charge, consider this, for the rich that he mentions in 1 Timothy 6. He tells the rich not to give away all that they have, but he tells them, don't be haughty or set your hopes on the uncertainty of riches. We could think of any phenomenal gift that the Spirit might give in a similar context, that perhaps one reason why the Spirit doesn't give them is because we ask wrongly, because we want to spend that gift on our passions, to make much of ourselves, to think more highly of ourselves, because we're inclined to be haughty and to set our hopes on phenomenal gifts. The problem, it isn't with the grandeur of the gift, but in its ripeness for self-glory. The same is true for these very gifts that Paul speaks of in these verses. But the things that Paul more, that would make application here, that if Paul were ministering with us, that he would convey to us, the things that might actually pull more on our heartstrings, might not be that we're looking and longing for such phenomenal, supernatural gifts like these. But perhaps if Paul were writing this letter directly to us, maybe it would sound a little bit more like this. If I speak or sing from the front in public worship, if I get to run the slides in the service, if I practice all hospitality, sign up for all the meal trains, do all the evangelism, have all of the children, maybe those are the kinds of things that are at play in your own hearts and affections. That if you so labor and are gifted to accomplish such things, good things, things that would be pleasing to God, things that the Spirit empowers, that we might walk in good works of Christian devotion. They can be good things, but they are good things that can be twisted by our sinful flesh as a means of self-glory, of boasting. So church, forgo the phenomenal. But you don't need to. You don't need to forgo the phenomenal if you find the way. And the second point, I'm making reference to how Paul concludes chapter 12. It wasn't chapter 12 when he wrote it, right? But that's how we've split it up to organize it, right? In the previous sentence, he makes reference to seeking the higher gifts, and I'll show you still the more excellent way. If we find the way, well, then all is fair game. Any expression of the Spirit among us, any gift that he gives is for our good in the building up of the body if it is governed by that more excellent way. That way is highlighted in the refrain of these three verses, but have not love. That's the core issue and why Paul repeats that same phrase 3 times over. The problem is that Corinth does not have love. They don't love as they ought. Love is that more excellent way that we must find in carrying out any act of service or gifting. All of those phenomenal things and all of those opportunities that you and I are more inclined to, they are only of value and worth if they are governed by love. If love is the controlling force that is operative in how those gifts and acts of devotion and service are conducted. Love is the determining thing here. But in Paul's mind, love, it is not just strong desire like how it is so often used today. Right? The refrain of love is love. You can't help who it is that you love or what it is that you love. It's that expression of just, well, I just love this thing, so you can't hold that against me. I've got this strong desire for this thing, and you can't judge me for loving that. It's this driving force within me. That's not what Paul means. That's not what he's conveying here. It's not psychology's unconditional positive regard. That's not the kind of love that he has in mind. Rather, love is the selfless concern for others. It's not just affections. It's not just emotions. It's not just a way to regard someone, but it is selfless. And there is a concern, naturally, and that concern is other-oriented, not self-oriented. It's not how strong my desires are, but it's about you. It's about the other. Not my glory, but your glory. I want to see your glory rise. I want to make much of you, give honor to you. That's what love does. We see this kind of love expressed throughout Paul's letter here. It is a spirit of gentleness. 1 Corinthians 4:21. It's the building up of others. 1 Corinthians 8:1. And of course, that's how Paul goes on to express it in verses 4 through 7 here in this chapter. This kind of love, this vision of love, this selfless concern for others, it is what governs a spouse to not withhold conjugal rights, like what Paul talks about in chapter 7. It's what leads an apostle to refrain from demanding his due, as Paul wrote in chapter 9. So often, our acts of service, they're a function of social capital. We do loving things, not exclusively out of a motivation of selfless concern for others, but we do so to bank favors. I'll do this for you, knowing that when the time comes, I'm going to be able to call you and you're going to scratch my back, right? You're going to help me out with a favor. That's so often the case. We bring a meal, shovel a sidewalk, give a ride to school so that at some point down the road, a favor will be repaid. I did this very thing on Friday afternoon. There was in my study, working on this very sermon and working, having the church office at home affords some benefits. And so as I'm working my sermon, I pause and I go throw a load of laundry in the wash. And eat my lunch, just quick throw dinner in the oven, so that's often in cooking. My wife, she's out with a friend who's in town for the weekend, and she asks, "Hey, can you pick up the kids?" I text back, "Well, yeah, sure, I can do that too." All the while, trying to write up what I think Paul is conveying here, what might be beneficial for us today. And I was just about to send a text back to my wife. And here's what the text read. Doing all the laundry, making the dinner, writing the sermon, caring for the children, and just about to hit send when the Holy Spirit says, "And have not love." Right here I'm thinking, man, my wife, she is pretty blessed to be married to a man like me, doing all this great stuff. She's pretty lucky. Right, those things that I was doing, I was trying to bless my family, bless my wife, bless you all. Good endeavors. Using gifts, I trust even. Acts of Christian devotion. But they can be taken by the flesh from their good motive of selfless concern for others in order to bank favors for self-glory, to make much of myself. But the solution, though, in these things and the dangers that come with using gifts of the Spirit and walking in the good works that God has prepared beforehand for us to walk in, the solution isn't to stop exercising the gifts. It's not to stop doing good and kindly loving things. No, it's to find the more excellent way of being governed by love. Being governed by that selfless concern for others with no expectation of repayment. Love is the highest Christian virtue because it is the one that most clearly is embodied in Christ. God loved the world in this way, that he gave his one and only Son so that everyone who would believe on him would not perish but have eternal life. That was an expression of God's love for the world. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. John 15:13. The high watermark of love is none less than Christ's incarnation and death for us. That selfless concern for others. Complete, full, final expression of love of God in Christ to sinners. Such unfathomable, selfless concern for you. So lean into love like that. Lean in there. Press in. Ask for God's help to convict you when you use your gifts that He's given you, when you walk in faithfulness before Him, and you do so in a manner for your own praise, that you might boast, for your own self-glory. Ask for the Spirit to bring conviction and remove the blinders so that you might be governed in all that you do by love. And as you do so, discover purpose, significance, and gain. This is our third point. I'm drawing this from that final step in Paul's logic here in each of these three verses, the negative result that he describes when we go about great and good and godly things but have not love. The result is not good. The result is that I'm a noisy gong. I am nothing. I gain nothing. You see, gongs and cymbals, they can have a beautiful expression when they're used according to their purpose. Right? If a toddler goes to a drum kit and just starts smashing away on the cymbal, that doesn't sound pleasant. That's not the design of the cymbal. Right? If I sit over here on the cajon like Nathaniel, right, and I'm trying to do this thing, like, it's not going to sound good. It's like, just stop. No, don't do that. Right? It's no good. It's not the purpose. I don't know how to operate that thing. So there's a good and right purpose there. And when it's not used according to its purpose, it does no value. There's no meaningful significance to know all that there is to know or to have insight into all mysteries if you don't have love. What good is that? Right? All you get is the puffing up of knowledge. It's vanity. And Paul says in such a case, he's nothing. He bears no significance. And what will you gain? If you sell all that you have and you give up your very own body without love, you gain nothing. You gain nothing meaningful or lasting. Maybe people will remember you in that great act that you did for a little bit. Let's bring this home to us. Right? What God has made us to be driven to have purpose and significance and gain. We're, as humanity, a very motivated people, right? There are motivators out there that drive us. And purpose, significance, and gain are great motivators to help us to do good things. This is why you can find countless books and innumerable YouTubers who all espouse the way to find purpose. If you want to have meaning in your life, they'll tell you the list of things that you just simply need to do. I heard recently that studies show that if you want to have comfortable middle-class income, right, if that's the driving purpose of your life, all you got to do is follow 3 simple steps in order. You need to graduate high school. You need to get a full-time job, and you need to get married before you have kids. Right? Just do these things, and you'll accomplish the purpose of your life, to have a comfortable lifestyle. But maybe that isn't all that you're aiming for. Your goal maybe is something more lasting. Your goal is generational wealth, and so you're driven to start businesses and invest wisely. Or maybe you look for significance in social transformation. So the call for you is to be radical and to do hard things, to implement a rule of life And such things, all of these things, they can all be good, certainly. But the most that they can offer is really just the praise of others. That others would look on you and ooh and awe over the purpose and significance and gain that you have accomplished in this life. Anyone can do those things and receive their reward. But friend, the praise of man is a fleeting fix. It will always leave you looking for a new high. So how can you find purpose, significance, and gain that extends beyond the grave? It is through the selfless concern for others, so that your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Being motivated to leave a lasting impact on this world, that's not a bad motive. Being motivated by reward, it is not a bad motive. Jesus holds out to us the promise of gain, of receiving a reward from your Father in heaven. And so if you don't want to be a purposeless gong, an insignificant nobody, or an unrewarded martyr, pursue the more excellent way. Pursue the purpose and significance and gain of selfless concern for others. That is the love that Paul is chiefly talking about. He's not mainly referencing the love for the Lord. He's talking about the horizontal relationships here within the church. The problem that is going on there in Corinth is that these gifts are wreaking havoc within the body because they have not love. That they are seeking purpose and significance and gain for themselves. So the solution is to follow after Christ in selfless concern for others, for one another. That the body would be built up. That there would be an interdependence of mutual care among the body. That's the kind of love that Paul is envisioning. I think Jesus, he probably could have related to that same parental response I mentioned at the beginning. Like, that's not the point. I was thinking of Mark's gospel and how it is that Mark records not one, not two, but 3 instances where Jesus tells his disciples with great clarity that he is going to go to Jerusalem and die. And not a single time do the disciples respond very well. Just imagine Jesus, that's not the point, you guys. The third and most robust and clearest example, it comes in Mark 10, 33 through 34. Jesus tells his disciples, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise." Seems so clear, doesn't it? It's 8 o'clock, you guys. Get in the car. But James and John, what do they do in response? No, it's 7:57. They come to him, and they're looking to work an angle for self-glory, completely ignoring, it seems, in Mark's recording of it, of what Jesus has just said. Oh, well, Jesus, can we sit at your right and your left in your glory? So, you guys, that's not the point. You see, at the heart of the Christian life is the gospel. And at the heart of the gospel is the pursuit of purpose, significance, and gain through selfless concern of others. Jesus would accomplish every one of his purposes that he established from before the foundation of the world. He would receive the significance of a name that is above every other name. and he would gain all glory and honor and power. He would do so through love, through the selfless concern of others, by laying down his life and taking it up again for the common good of his people, for his body. Friend, have you taken for granted Christ's love and his gifts to you? Have you taken them for granted? Have you sought the gifts or opportunities for self-glory?